He built his own instruments in 43-tone unequal temperament, loved ancient Greece, traveled around for years as a hobo, and he established the theoretical underpinning that has come to define much of modern microtonal and zenharmonic thought. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Harry Partch. Harry Partch was born into a family of Presbyterian missionaries in June 1901 in Oakland, California. Had it not been for the Boxer Rebellion, Partch might have been born in China. The Partches moved to southeast Arizona, which was at that point very much still a part of the lawless frontier, where his dad worked in the immigration services. Young Harry learned music from his mother, who taught him how to read it. And additionally, he learned a smattering of keyboard, brass, and string instruments. The family lived in Albuquerque for Partch's teenage years, and it's there that he first became interested in writing music. Partch graduated from high school in 1919, the same year that his father died, and the very next year his mother was killed in an accident with a Los Angeles trolley. The 19-year-old Partch was now completely parentless, and he enrolled at the University of Southern California to study music, but he dropped out after 2 years. He still liked music, but USC just wasn't a good fit for him, and so he went on up to San Francisco. In San Francisco, he checked out a lot of library books and did a lot of self-directed study, and one of these books was Hermann von Helmholtz's On the Sensations of Tone as a Physiological Basis for the Theory of Music. This opened Partch's eyes to the acoustical fact that had plagued Western music theory for centuries, the fact that no system of 12 tones can be both totally in tune and create a full circle of fifths. The alternative to a system of established tones and ratios between them, as you would find on any piano, was a system called just intonation, which works purely in pure ratios derived from the harmonic series. Just intonation means that the tuning of particular notes will depend entirely upon context. How you tune, say, an E is different if it's a fifth above another note or a third above another. What are you trying to accomplish? String players do this sort of automatically. They're taught to tune to one another in ways that are closer than 12-tone equal temperament. When you're looking on a piano, you're going to get 12-tone equal temperament. It's going to be an octave divided into 12 equal chunks. On organs, you typically see a system called well temperament, which is something that Bach would have been familiar with. And this is sort of a middle ground in that it still attempts to create a full circle of fifths, but it doesn't tune those 12 notes exactly evenly, so you still have different shadings depending on what key you're in. For the sake of experimentation, Partch wrote a string quartet using just intonation principles, and used paper to mark off where those ratios were on the strings such that the players didn't have to guess. By 1928, he had started drafting a book called Exposition of Monophony. He now found himself as an itinerant worker, and he found himself in New Orleans around the start of the Great Depression, and it's there that he symbolically burned all of his early music in a break from the European tradition. He said that he was not faithful to himself because he tried to pursue respectable music instead of the music that he wanted to write. Into the Flames went a symphonic poem, a string quartet, a ton of smaller works, and an unfinished piano concerto. His new philosophy of music was actually one that was extremely old. He was facing down the same problems of ratios and tuning as had Pythagoras himself. He felt as though something in music history had gone fundamentally wrong somewhere, and that was the move towards 12-tone equal temperaments. He said it was a fatal day in Halberstadt in the year 1351 that set music history off on the wrong track totally, because this was when the first 12-tone keyboard was produced, even though equal temperament was a long way away. This proved the ancestor of an entire hegemonic system, although he did admit that the first 12-tone equal temperament system seemed to have been derived in China by Prince Chu in 1596. In New Orleans, Partch met a luthier, whom he commissioned to build a viola with the elongated fingerboard of the cello, and with a custom bridge that could accommodate triple stops. This was built to accommodate a new scale, which started out as 29 tones to the octave. He initially called this instrument the monophone, but then changed the name to the Adapted Viola. But to be fair, you can play the rep he wrote for it on a regular viola if you're willing to practice long and hard enough, and break some triple stops as well. I've heard it done because it's not like there are a lot of adapted violas around. The earliest piece for this, 17 Lyrics of Li Po, featured singing in this microtonal style as well. He reported to be stunned because not long after he conceptualized the Adapted Viola, he learned that famed astronomer Galileo Galilei's father Vincenzo, who was a music theorist in his own right, had apparently written his own plays and dramas that he would sing, recite that is, and accompany himself on the viola. You see, a lot of composers of the early Baroque era, the ones that were instrumental in the deriving of opera as an art form, for instance, were obsessed with the Greeks as well, and their attempts at recreating Greek music is what led to the rise of opera in the first place. This love of the Greeks, that is not a new thing. Partch understandably felt a deep and abiding connection to the past. He hated the sort of classically trained approach to singing, and he pursued his own voice, like literally his own style of singing, not just compositionally. He wanted singing to follow the diction and the speaking tones of someone who is actually speaking. He regarded the voice as innately able to do the things that he outlined so rigorously in theoretical terms. He'd understood that the voice was naturally going to go into perfect tuning, perfect just intonation with another voice if left to its own devices. And that's why he did not like the piano as an accompanimental device to singers. He thought it was just contrary to the fundamental nature of how the human voice worked. Partch also didn't like the fact that musicians spoke in a kind of theoretical code, things like tonic and dominant. Like, these things don't really exist. Like, they're not describing concrete things in the world. They're not describing tones per se. They're not describing things that come from actual acoustical phenomenon. They're just words that we use to describe things that crop up a lot in a certain type of music. He saw this kind of language as historical falsifications that gained legitimacy just because they were convenient. It's dry enough to bore those even who like music, and he thought it drilled the creative spirit out of students. To quote my old theory professor, "The job of music theory is to suppress creativity. We had a graduate seminar on suppressing students' creative freedom." Beginning music theory he saw as being incredibly problematic because it never started with fundamental acoustical questions, like why do we have 12 tones to the octave, and why do they have to be evenly spaced? He saw this as music education dismissing truly individual creativity from the outset. But what also bothered Partch was a discrepancy, is what he saw between Western philosophy and sort of the rest of the Western world and Western music, and how they developed he saw as kind of being at odds with one another. Ultimately, the history of the Western world and Western thought and Western culture is one of increased prosperity and of increased individual rights over the years. Like, it's a long haul, but, more people are part of the great experiment of democracy now than they were way back in the day. We've expanded those rights and privileges to more and more groups of people. And Partch said, okay, let's say this is the history of the Western world. Why do we not apply that same concept to music? Why don't we afford musicians and composers the same rights as individuals as you would in the political system? The monolithic nature of Western music and this system was at odds with what the rest of the philosophy espoused. There was an inherent contradiction between the music and the culture, and he saw the way to fix this as resetting it back to the ancient Greeks. The innovative music that he wrote using in the early stages of the system curried favor with modernist Henry Cowell and his New Music Society, and in 1933 Partch was sent to New York, where he met all the biggest names in avant-garde music of the day. But this didn't solve Partch's problem, which is that he had no money. The Great Depression wasn't getting any better, but he eventually got $1,500, about $29,200 in today's money, from the Carnegie Corporation to go study in Europe. Of all the people he met there, musicologist Kathleen Schlesinger was probably the most influential. She specialized in instrument history and also did a lot of work in reconstructing ancient Greek music as well. Partch's research was conducted primarily at the British Museum between September 1934 and March 1935. There he distilled what he could of frankly boring texts on acoustical properties and theory into a landmark tome that would eventually be published as Genesis of a Music, an informative and educational volume that stemmed from Partch's irreverent and non-academic approach to a subject he legitimately found fascinating. This fascination comes through when reading it. The book starts out with this searing, roaring blast through music history in a very honest and direct way, which is all in favor of bolstering Partch's conceptualization of music. The opening chapter, entitled From Emperor Chun to the Vacant Lot, spells out two competing tracks of music history. All music could be divided into two categories: corporeal music and abstract music. Corporeal music was, to Partch, music drama, or any individualistic music that was of a time and a place, a here and a now, whereas abstract music was more about the collective will and expression of larger groups of people, things that transcended time and place. What makes Partch's crash course in history so refreshing is that even though he's using it to categorize music in these different ways, he does, in one chapter, what most conservatories fail to do in however many years you study at them, which is he gives a history of music. Not just Western music, he has a history of the entirety of music. He manages to do this in part by not just being irreverent, and he's well cited, but it's because he was focusing specifically on corporeal music. So he's essentially giving you his take and thoughts on music drama over the years and centuries and millennia, as opposed to trying to give all the details of everything. He compared the Greeks to the Chinese, and specifically in terms of music drama, because he felt as though both of them had independently figured out something between intonation and drama. Like there was some connection there that he wanted to dig into. He also linked the antiphonal practices of the early Christian church as being essentially Middle Eastern in origin. To give you a sense of Partch's writing style, let me give you a quote real quick. Let me get this right. W.J. Henderson declares that modern opera is the child of the Roman Catholic Church. We might also say that resentment is a child of a good solid fist on the jaw. You're going to be hard-pressed to find this level of fun and irreverence in writing about music anywhere else. You might find it in like Slinemsky or something, but this stuff is real good. The Vacant Lot of Partch's chapter title refers specifically to how American music theater ended up as a vague and directionless morass, with no corporeality to be found anywhere, in part because there was no cultivated audience for experimental drama in theater. After years of experimentation and a lot of research, Partch eventually settled into a system of using 43 tones to the octave, and the details of his microtonal system are so complex that they really do deserve their own video. To make a long story short, he extended the system of just intonation to 43 tones, but because he was working with pure intervals, you didn't end up with 43 evenly spaced intervals. One of the reasons that Partch tapped out at 43 relates to his concept of the limit. His microtonal concepts are, again, for this later video, trust me. So we're going to get into that then, but it's not super relevant now. For now, let's just think of the limit as your prime factor. It's a limit on how complex your ratios can get. So basically he included a complexity up to the point of the 11th harmonic. You didn't get any more complicated ratio-wise than that note. And he tapped out there because, you could go to the 13th harmonic, for instance, but if he'd done that, the scale would have been prohibitively large. He would have gone up to 60 or more tones. A 43-tone scale was possible, not practical, but possible using analog means. If you went up to the 13 limit, you would have had to have relied on synthesis technology to try to get this done. And even then, trying to build a keyboard that was able to play notes in this scale would have just been... people do it, but 43 was enough of a breakthrough. I don't want to criticize him for not doing like 65 or something. Because Partch's system is in just intonation, all of the notes are defined by their ratios. The ratios are not nearly as complicated as the ratios that you would find if you applied that same view to, say, a 12-tone equally tempered keyboard. What this does mean is that there is a central pitch to which all these ratios refer. And this could be anything, but for Partch it was a G. This means that sometimes people think that Partch's music all is just in the key of G and there's no ability to modulate anywhere else. But this discounts the fact that when you have 43 tones at your disposal, when you're working with the 11 limit, you can actually move around and you can modulate sort of to different areas. It's kind of uneven and you can't do it consistently, and G is really the home, it's where it's designed to go. But you can move to other keys because you have enough tones to be able to do that. That's not something you could get if you did a just intonation scale in say, 3 or 5 limit. Intervals with small numbers in their ratios, Partch noted, were more consonant to the human ear than simply something that was plucked out of the overtone series. He called this whole system of ratio-based intervals, which arose from a central pitch, monophony, with a capital M, and noted that it too contained relative consonance and dissonance, but that was all contextual and depended largely on how complicated your ratios got. The ironic thing about this system is that Partch really didn't do a whole lot in terms of harmony. Most microtonal composers use these systems to achieve otherworldly sounds. They like the ability to generate new and unexpected harmonies, to access higher and higher consonances within the overtone series, or simply make more familiar chords like major and minor triads more in tune than they would be on a piano. But Partch's music, because it's so percussive, largely doesn't do this. He's interested in melody, he's interested in rhythm, he's interested in a lot of things, and harmony just doesn't fall all that high on the list. Partch's music is so heavily percussive that the scales and harmonies that he used are almost a background element to everything else about his music. And the idea that he was just this guy who came up with this tuning system, that this was his entire life, that this was his crowning achievement, or his sole philosophy, was what Partch called the one-half-truth of the one-fourth factor. It's hard to find musical universals, but one of the through lines that I've heard from almost every composition professor is the concept of tension and release. And this is really widely applicable, in part because it's so vague and broad. Sort of like a political slogan. It means whatever you think it means. But the idea behind having a more tense section followed by a more released section, it's not really a term, is it? I'm going to roll with it anyway. You can apply this to almost any type of music, and you can apply it to things that aren't even of the West, that is. You can look at any genre and you can think of a certain level of tension and a certain level of release. How that's applied depends entirely on the music you're looking at. So in Partch's case, he saw Western music largely as the addition of dissonances. But he saw these dissonances as often just tacked on notes in a chord with no good harmonic understanding of why those notes were there. They were just extra dissonances packed into a chord to make it crunchy or juicy or something. And what he saw as dissonance was more complex ratios and consonants as simpler ratios. Something that was derived from how we perceive tones and intervals in our ears naturally. The best way to produce dissonance is to just find something that's relatively high up in the overtone series. And approximating these is something that 12-tone equal temperament is just laughably bad at doing. He noted that equal temperament had an advantage in that you could squeeze 12 fifths into 7 octaves, but he said that that was the only good thing about it, and that, I quote, "The ramification of evil complications in the one little act of perverting nature is actually endless." Equal temperament was only practical in that it had a huge repertoire, an advantage that all these other systems lacked. Nonetheless, he did believe that composers should have the freedom to choose whatever tuning system they so wished. He wanted to break the hegemonic system of 12-tone equal temperament. If you wanted to use it, that was still fine. Anyway, the adapted viola could play any interval you wanted, and he could have made a whole ensemble of carefully modified string instruments with tacks in the fingerboard to show where the purest ratios were, but he wanted more than that. He built his own instruments from scratch, and the majority of them are percussion instruments. Because Partch built his own custom instruments, playing his music is a lot more complicated than just getting the score and parts, rehearsing, programming, and playing. Additionally, performers have to figure out Partch's notational practices, which is a far cry from Western notation. Well, standard Western notation. It sort of looks like that on first viewing. Upon Partch's death, the instruments came into the possession of Dean Drummond, and upon his death in 2013, were entrusted to microtonal composer Charles Corey, who as of this filming is a professor at the University of Washington. Partch's collection of instruments is commonly known as his instrumentarium, but Partch never actually used this term. The instruments he built, as they were focused on tuning and timbre, weren't refined to produce a wider dynamic range like, say, most standard Western orchestral instruments. This means that whoever's in charge of conducting a Partch score needs to have a great ear for balance, on top of everything else, which is mostly produced by careful arrangement of the instruments on the stage. Science, Partch noted in Genesis of Music, was not willing to improve musical instruments unless said improvement had a commercially viable function. Because of this, Partch had okayed subtle amplification of certain instruments so that a better balance could be achieved. This is very necessary when you're playing an instrument which is literally made from old-fashioned light bulbs. This, friends, is the Mazda marimba, named not for the car, but for the brand of light bulb, which was in turn named for the god of Zoroastrianism, which also lent its name to the car company. Each instrument has its own characteristic notation, so the difficulty only compounds. But it's not actually all that difficult to read. The issue is that Western performers are trained to be as fluent as possible in the standard notational practices, so that anything that lies out of that isn't fluid. It's like learning a new alphabet more than it's like learning a new language. His scores are more akin to tablature, and the more that performers are aware of the ratios of his system, the better equipped they are to handle the music. He said that notation was the least of a music's ingredients, and to a degree that's true, because all notation does is express your thoughts directly to the performers. It's a method of communication, but as I've noted in my Composition Masterclass series, notation is hugely important, because being able to communicate those ideas as succinctly and effectively as possible is a huge part of making sure that your music can be practically performed. There were, of course, occasions when Partch would still write for standard instruments, and it's in those cases that we see him modifying his system. We see him approaching them from, again, a more practical perspective. He's not expecting a clarinet player to learn 43 unequal tones to the octave, so instead he finds a middle ground. So when he calls for the clarinet in The Bewitched or King Oedipus, or a brass band in Revelation in a Courthouse Park, he does so writing in a system that's color-coded, it's color-based, where he's basically writing in 12-tone equal temperament, but he uses colors to indicate different shadings up and down. The thinking here is that you would get close enough to the note that the players would naturally tune to the right, very subtle harmonic inflections without having to worry so much about it. We are getting way off track here on a temporal level, so let's snap back to the timeline, and we're back in the mid-1930s, and Partch, well, that $1,500 in 1934 money didn't last that long, so eventually he found himself back in the United States, and he found himself traveling around again as a hobo. Most sources indicate that aside from this time he spent in England, he was basically a hobo between fall 1928 and spring 1943. His free time and energy was devoted to research, instrument building, and composing. He reconstructed and updated the ancient Greek kitara, as well as his second 43-tone to the octave organ. By 1950, he would come to perfect this design, what he called the chromolodion, by equipping it with buttons such that full harmonies could be played, which is kind of difficult to do when one octave is what keyboard players are used to seeing as nearly 4 octaves. It's functionally the same principle as what's behind the accordion buttons, except those buttons are more for convenience than absolute necessity. He also used a color-based system to assist players of the chromolodion in finding the right pitches on this retuned organ. He noted that even though it was weird to see one note on the page and play it and have a different note sound, it wasn't nearly as weird as it seemed. You could notate the chromolodion in standard notation, and it worked pretty well. Players got used to it after a while because, you know, it was still a thing where you saw a note and you played the note. If you just got used to the fact that one half step was now, like, really small, you did pretty well for yourself as a chromolodion player. Different versions of the chromolodion then expanded on the ability for the keys to bounce back, so the action was better. And this allowed the chromolodion to be more part of the ensemble as opposed to just a pitch checker for 43-tone unequal temperament. And a later development actually decreased the size of the octave such that more notes could be played. Instead of one octave taking up this much space, it took around like that much space. Partch also invented the term tonality flux, which refers to very small but very drastic microtonal fluctuations between different chords and sonorities. You could nestle chords inside other chords and harmonies inside other harmonies that were impossible, hard to conceptualize even on 12-tone equal temperament. So let's take an example. In 12-tone equal temperament, you can go from a major third to a minor third by keeping one note the same. But in smaller temperament, since you have intervals smaller than the half step, you can nest a smaller interval inside the big interval. So CE becomes C quarter sharp and E quarter flat, which is a minor third. This example is in quarter tones and has a lot in common with the idea of field shifting, as proposed by Czech microtonalist Alois Hobo, as the harmony can change radically in a seemingly impossibly small space. By the mid-1940s, things seem to have settled down somewhat for Partch. He got a long-sought Guggenheim grant in 1943 for the composition of his monophonic cycle, which entailed building the instruments first. And then he got a Carnegie Hall premiere of it. This relative financial stability allowed him to take up a position at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He used the university's resources to build more instruments, stage more pieces, record things, just generally career advancement. This was also where he finally put together the final pieces of what became Genesis of Music, published in 1949. But his years at the university were as a guest lecturer. He was essentially an artist in residence, and he was upset that they would not give him a full-time position, so in 1951 he quit and moved across the country back to his hometown of Oakland, California. Mills College, which had embraced the radical instrument building of fellow West Coaster Lou Harrison, was putting out a production of Partch's King Oedipus, and while they did the performance, a planned recording never materialized. Even though Partch had met with William Butler Yeats in Europe during his Carnegie-funded travels, and had gone so far as to note Yeats's speech patterns so he could encode them into his music, the Yeats estate nonetheless blocked the recording. Undaunted, Partch went back and he made his own version of the text. In fact, he went back to the same translation that Yeats used, so they ended up being kind of similar, and this was eventually performed and recorded in 1954. In 1953, Partch had found some space in Sausalito, California to house his instruments, put on performances, and importantly, sell his recordings via mail order, which was his primary source of income. Partch loved the promise of recordings, and he latched onto nascent musical technology as a method for composers to bypass performers and speak directly to their audiences. He thought of it as akin to a painter painting a painting once. Prior to cultivating a collective of instrumentalists who could perform his pieces live, Partch would go into the studio and do this early multi-track overdubbing. He would spend 14-hour days for 2, 3, 4 weeks at a time just playing different instruments over himself, and these eventually became the recordings that he would sell for mail order. Just imagine how much faster that would have gone had he had access to even the most basic digital audio workstation. Like, I want to go back in time and give this man GarageBand. No, I wouldn't do that to him. I'd give him at least Logic Express. Partch was ultimately not thrilled about using purely electronic means, that is, synthesis, to achieve his musical ends. He did not think that audio engineers were a good fit for musicians, whose musicianship was inherently tied to being human and spontaneous on the stage. He was also distressed that these instruments were being wired inextricably for a 12-tone equal temperament. And here I quote once again, "There are cases of failing to see the forest for the trees," he wrote, "but this is more a matter of proceeding to cut down the trees and set them up again as equidistant telephone poles." Gosh, I love his writing. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Partch spent some time in residence at the University of Illinois to stage further productions, like King Oedipus or further reworkings of Greek drama, but he also felt that eventually that university did not support his artistic goals, and in 1962 he moved again to California, this time to Petaluma, where he found studio space about 40 miles north of San Francisco. But he wouldn't even stay there for very long. He returned to this peripatetic existence, traveling up and down California. His travels didn't take him all across the country anymore. Partch's belief in the necessity of corporeal music, that is, music drama, meant that much of his music is devoted to this dramatic form. He wrote large-scale theater pieces which sought to blur the lines between dancers and musicians and actors. Everyone was everything all the time, and for that reason you can't just listen to a Partch piece. You can't even really watch a video of a Partch piece and get a sense of being there because some of the instruments are built to be felt more than to be heard. They are complete experiences. This wasn't just an extension of a Wagnerian Gesamtkunstwerk, total work of art. The musicians were to be one with their instrument, and as important as actors as anyone else on stage. What was Wagnerian was that all art was one, but he feared that this hyper-specialization would mean that his works would be more in the realm of a curiosity or very devoted fans as opposed to being disseminated to the wider public. Notwithstanding the airtime that his piece Barstow would come to get on Dr. Demento's radio show. To Partch, the kinds of voices that Wagner needed to carry over his large orchestras annihilated any semblance of narrative arc or flow. They were a far cry from the kinds of speech-like patterns he was so obsessed with and liked to employ. But the concept of integrating works of art for Partch goes way, way, way beyond anything that Wagner could have possibly dreamed. And this is the attitude that I think encapsulates Partch's aesthetic attitudes. It's far more compelling and far more relevant to his role in the history of music than, say, his 43-tone system and all the terminology that has emerged out of that, or his fun life story as the self-taught hobo who wrote really fun passages in his books. The problem that he faced was that there were very few truly interdisciplinary performers. Not only was this a huge shortcoming in the way that Western music had developed, he also had very specific ideas as to how his works should be staged and performed. He left very little room for competing interpretations of his works. This meant that he often butted heads with choreographers, or even musicians who weren't as into being actors because they were trained, say, in conservatory training in percussion. You're used to being small. You're used to being in an orchestra pit. You're used to being out of the way and doing your thing as innocuously as possible if you happen to be on the stage. Partch didn't want that. He wanted them to be a part of the action. If performers didn't take advantage of their dual roles as both musicians and actors, they should be subject to, and I'm quoting again, experimental hanging by the gonads on a treble guitar string. The core point was that a musician to Partch was someone who did more than just play the right notes at the right time. You could stand out. And this is why he was able to build such big instruments, such as the bass marimba or the marimba eroica. These are particularly notable examples of huge instruments, which must be performed by musicians in tip-top physical shape. Partch rarely got a performance that he liked because his demands went so strongly against the grain of the typical performance environment. He required far more rehearsal than was usual, talent across fields and interdisciplinary ways, and trying to find enough performers to do that and stick to his vision was very difficult to do. Performances, after all, were typically put on by performers who didn't have the kind of intimate knowledge of his music or his system that they needed to have in order to put on good performances of them. From a practical perspective, he kind of wrote himself into a corner. Despite coining terms which are part and parcel of the microtonal and zinharmonic language of the present day, Partch didn't think of himself as a microtonalist per se, rather as someone who reset music back to the ancient Greeks and extended their practices into some different direction. Recall that he felt that Western music hadn't developed in line with Western culture, and that he felt that it had become too specialized, specifically in music. Partch wanted to reset the Western attitude towards music drama, and so he also looked to non-Western origins, such as no theater. For his masterpiece, Delusion of the Fury, 20 players have to commit to months of rehearsals, interpreting Partch's unique notation and then memorizing their parts in their entirety. And that's only possible for this piece if you've already extensively played Partch's music before. Delusion of the Fury incorporates the Japanese no play Atsumori with a traditional Ethiopian folk tale in a format of tragedy then comedy, typical of the ancient Greeks. Partch was clear in that the costumes should not convey anything exactly. They should be old but not stereotypically Asian or African. For Partch, purely abstract forms with features and labels were nonsensical because they didn't actually tell a story. In 1970, the Harry Partch Foundation was founded to handle the day-to-day administration of Partch's creative work. Partch himself was getting up there in age, and the years and wear and tear on his body from, all the homelessness had finally caught up to him and taken a toll. He had only been officially retired for about a year when he died of a heart attack in September 1974 at the age of 73. He was cremated, and his ashes were tossed off the Santa Monica Pier. While composers throughout the 20th century were trying to respond to the horrors and realities of a post-Two World War world, Partch didn't believe that artists had a duty to respond to their age. He felt the opposite. He felt like the artist's duty was to be an antidote to the age. He believed that the artist had a duty to transcend the age entirely, actually, and he felt like the response to the age attitude was, and here's an actual quote, downright idiotic. He also seemed to be immune to what others thought of him. He called this practice termite psychology. And this is a rare gift among composers, or really any creative artist. But the problem is that because he wasn't interested in getting people to like him per se, he wasn't as interested in self-promoting as many other composers were. So long as he was getting enough money from mail orders that were coming in, he didn't have any reason to self-promote. Partch believed that ritual was the underlying key to understanding almost all human behavior throughout time, and he noted a universality of human behavior. He compared ancient Greek customs to the present day constantly. Like, Partch would make references to the ancient Greeks and their stories in the same way that someone in conversation would bring up, something that happened in current events, or sports, or the weather. Part of what attracted Partch to ancient Greece was a loosened sense of morality. He was, to use a modern phrase, spiritual but not religious, and he felt like the West had been infected by an overly puritanical moral code. Partch called himself a traditionalist from the ancient ages, who apparently pursued a radical agenda of sanitation and health in some long-forgotten civilization, and was put to death for it. He also felt as though if he stepped far back enough in time, he would actually just end up in the present. There's this cyclical and atemporal nature to his worldview. Basically, he didn't like any linear conceptualization of time, and there's a couple reasons as to why. You could theorize that this was because of his time as a hobo, when things seemed to happen in short spurts with a lot of gaps of nothingness in between. Kind of like life in quarantine, eh? Or you could say that maybe this was just how his brain worked, and that's why being a hobo was of such interest to him, or he wasn't bothered by that existence as much as some other people might be. He was able to do it for 15 years or so without much of a problem with it. Or some have cited the fact that he was gay as a reason that he would be so attracted to a worldview that was off from the standard Western morality. Because of this, it's theorized he was alienated from existence so much that he was able to adopt this atemporal worldview that made sense to him. It was his way of coping with his relationship to the rest of society. Partch was also beset by several medical issues, not the least of which was a lingering case of syphilis, although it doesn't seem like this ever affected him all that much. That is, there's no indication that he was mentally affected by the tertiary symptoms of the disease, as so often happens when it goes untreated. But this isn't to say that Partch was exactly the most normal member of society either. He once gave away his car just because he didn't want to drive it anymore, but he still needed to get around places, so it was up to his friends to drive him around. He didn't even warn people he was going to do this. He just gave away his car. It was outside of a restaurant one day. He also had this habit of drinking his tea not like a normal person. He would drink it through a washcloth. But most unusually, he had this habit of communicating to himself by screaming at himself in these wildly different voices, which obviously deeply unnerved his friends. Lou Harrison thought that this was his way of working through problems, so that, if he was faced with some particular issue, he would embody different sides of this argument by yelling at himself, because this is, generally his friends, when they recounted the fact that he did this, he was in another room of his house, away from people, and he would just be screaming at himself, as one does. He also had this habit of communicating in very cryptic ways. There was this time where he left an ice pick on filmmaker Stephen Puglio's pillow to indicate that they weren't going to be friends anymore. Partch's music is absolutely one of a kind, and no one has even come close to writing music in the way that he did. Danlee Mitchell, Partch's longtime friend, heir, and eventual executive director of the Harry Partch Foundation, had first encountered Partch's music in 1956 while an undergraduate percussion major at the University of Illinois. When asked of how he conceived of Partch's music, Mitchell cited Partch's linearity and expressiveness that was rooted, ironically for many, in the Romantic tradition, citing Partch's early music as the last gasp of the Germanic art song tradition, and then moving on from there in his own direction. But when it came to the mature music of his 43-tone system and his custom instruments, it required a more communal approach than one that has typically been valued by Western cultures. The closest figure you can get to him is probably Lou Harrison, another gay American who was based out west for the majority of his career, also constructed instruments based on just intonation practices, and was also inspired by the music of non-Western cultures. But Harrison approached his instrument construction from a totally different angle, as he based his instruments off of those of gamelan ensembles, and wasn't as into integrating theatricality into performances. Harrison was also more tuned into Eastern cultures than Partch was, for whom Delusion of the Fury was his only major large-scale work to be inspired by something non-Western. There's also the somewhat obvious comparison to Charles Ives in the sense of experimentation, and his early attempts to capture something of a masculine and rugged Americana. Going beyond music, the hobo side of him has a lot in common with the writings of Jack Kerouac. His music features wild and uneven rhythmic devices that seem to bridge the gap between Stravinsky's early pulsating modernism at the end of the Rite of Spring and the minimalist approach of composers like John Adams or Philip Glass. But early on, Partch was not as interested in rhythm as he would come to be. When working with vocal music, which is usually what he did early on, he dispensed with rhythmic notation entirely and let the vocal line guide the flow of the piece. He openly wondered about what composers who were especially sensitive to the natural inflections of the human voice, like Modest Mussorgsky, would have done had the musical system not settled into 12-tone equal temperament. He also used nonsense in expressive ways as well, going beyond words to something more primal. In the 1950s, he was inspired by the voice of Helen Keller, which was highly expressive even when the meaning could not be discerned. And he never abandoned 12-tone equal temperament in his listening life. He was a very good pianist who could whip out Chopin from memory after decades away from playing his works. Partch was as interested in the idea of music as he was by, well, actual music. But unlike the 20th century's boldest musical philosopher of the same ilk, John Cage, Partch's heavily theoretical and philosophically minded pieces work on the practical level as well. While Cage was putting together high-concept pieces that challenged the very nature of music making, Partch went a different direction and made music that worked on both a theoretical and acoustic level. You don't need to know how he put together his 43-tone scale to enjoy the end result, and that was why he made music. As fascinating as his theories are, they're only the backdrop to making an intense music that speaks to those without any theoretical knowledge at all.